Thank you for being here. I'd like to have us begin exactly where we will end, with a series of images about the human condition. These are photographs by Lee Jeffries, who films adults who are homeless and children who are homeless on the streets of Los Angeles and London. And the metaphor of homelessness will be a bit of what we'll be really addressing throughout this talk. I want to give you a bit of history. I'm a clinician and a developmental researcher in the field of psychology. And for reasons that will likely become clear in the next few minutes, I've taken my entire lifetime as a professional, over 40 years, focusing primarily on issues and places where there is exceptional suffering. So I've worked in prisons, I've worked in oncology units, psychiatric units, sexual abuse treatment programs. And for 5 years, I worked and lived full-time on Skid Row in Los Angeles, working with homeless adults. For the last 20 years, I've had the remarkable privilege of working with street-dependent teen, primarily parents here in Spokane, who come from histories of abuse and neglect, often leaving home at about the age of 11 or 12, and then showing up pregnant and having a child maybe at 13 or 14. And this is the population I've had the remarkable privilege of working with. So I've run groups for 20 years, and in those groups I hand out 3x5 cards to every member at the beginning of each group. And I say, I want you to write down on this card 1 or 2 sentences that describe for you the voice you hear in your head that you wish you didn't have to listen to. I do this with every group, and one year I asked one of the groups if they'd be willing to let me share these, and they said they would. But every time I do a group, as they hand these in, the message is almost always the same. So here are some very typical responses. You are damaged and not worth what undamaged people are worthy of. You're dirty, no one could ever love you, you don't count, you're only good for sex. You're a failure, you always let everybody down, you will never be loved. You're not good enough, no matter how hard you try, you can't do anything right. You don't have a chance, you are going to be left all alone. Now, given their histories, these internal messages that they carry through the day make a lot of sense. I've also had the privilege for 10 years to teach a course at Gonzaga University titled The Psychology of Intimacy. And you can imagine at the beginning of each semester, I have the students utilize a 3x5 card and write down 1 or 2 sentences that describe the voice in their head that they wish they didn't have to listen to through the day. And again, I was given permission to read these out loud. You're not good enough for anybody. People who say you aren't telling the truth. Nobody really cares about you. The ones that tried to care, you've pushed away. You're not worthy to be loved. You will never be loved. You will always be alone. You'll never accomplish anything. You never do enough. It's only going to get worse. You're not good enough for anybody. No one could ever truly love you. Now, the first question I need to ask you is, do you see much difference between these high-risk teens and these so-called low-risk 22-year-olds at a major university? Do you see much difference in their internal world? And I have done this with psychologists, ministers, educators, social workers, parents in all walks of life on 3 different continents. I guarantee you the answers are almost all the same. So it's like we wake up every morning with a maze that we're not sure how to get out of. And we start here, and we know we're supposed to get here, and we don't know how to get there. So we all have, I think, something in common, which is the same mantra. Now, quite literally, at the homeless shelter I've worked at, I don't call the groups parenting groups. I call them WTF groups. Because that gets them through the door. Because that's the question they're asking. Right? So, it doesn't really make any difference who we are. Many of us in this room and many of us watching this don't believe we're enough. In fact, many of us, I think, wonder if we actually matter. We have this kind of internal world where we're trying to figure out whether we're attractive enough, or smart enough, or intelligent enough, or creative enough, or enough. But underneath it all, there's this sense that in some way, we're not lovable. So one could say, at least within this culture, the human condition could be described as struggling with wounds of mattering. Now, as you know, this is a TED Talk, and what do you do in a TED Talk? You cut to the chase. So I'm going to cut to the chase. The most important thing I learned in graduate school took me 5 seconds to learn. I was in graduate school 5 years. 5 frickin' seconds, right? I walked into a classroom with Frank Kemper, my first clinical professor, and in a few minutes after an introduction, he spoke the following sentence, and it was 9 words. Every person you will ever meet has infinite worth. Every person you will ever meet has infinite worth. Every person. You will ever meet has infinite worth. In those 5 seconds, my worldview didn't just shift, it shattered. And quite literally, I've never been able to see people the same way since. Because before that, I'd seen people as okay and not okay and cool and groovy and not so cool and groovy, and I had them in these categories that I thought really made life make sense. And they were all highly conditional, and quite suddenly, I realized that no person is worth more than any other person. In fact, if I were to define evil, it would be the belief that some people are worth more than other people. And when we institutionalize that, it really becomes evil. Because all of us underneath all that exterior share this miraculous, infinite worth. Now, about 10 years ago, I have a good friend in Australia, Phillip Marshall, and he said something that struck me as almost exactly the same as what Frank Kemper had said 35 years before. We each matter, and we matter absolutely. One of my major mentors, a man I never had the opportunity to meet, Thomas Merton, Trappist monk, lived much of his adult life in Kentucky, was standing on the corner of 4th and Walnut in Lexington one day and was just watching people pass by and had this epiphany. And he wrote this: "At the center of our being is a point of pure truth. It is like a pure diamond blazing with the invisible light of heaven. It is in everybody. I have no program for the seeing. It is given. The gate of heaven is everywhere." The gate of heaven is everywhere. So Merton was saying that we have within us, each of us, this unrepeatable, fragile jewel. And then he goes on to say, there is no program for its seeing. There is absolutely no formula. There's no 5 bullet points. There's no 7 special steps. Infinite worth is just something that when we begin to see it, we begin to see it everywhere. Now, meanwhile, back in the land of WTF, we got a problem. Because in the land of WTF, we keep trying. And no matter how hard we try, we never get anywhere. I want to do a quick sidebar because I said earlier that I was an attachment researcher. And through 3 decades of studying attachment research and being a researcher myself, I have discovered there is a core emotional awareness at the heart of anybody who is secure, and it looks like this. It's the awareness that regardless of my body or my mind or my talents or however I am getting through life, I am lovable and loved. Now, I want to say that's nice work if you can get it, right? But a lot of us in this room don't have that worldview. Underneath so many of us watching, so many of us listening, that's not how we see ourselves. I am lovable and loved. Nice thought. Because what covers that up is this maze that we're caught in, this impossible maze. And it's a maze that is based on judgment and comparison. Again, am I attractive enough or smart enough or good enough? And a few years after I heard Frank say what he did, I had this aha moment, which has a little good news and a little bad news. The bad news is that the maze is rigged. It's a friggin' lie. I have never in my entire life seen anybody make it from point A to point Z. And if they do, they start back at point A the next second. Nobody makes it on the maze. The good news is that this maze has nothing to do with who you actually are. The good news is that underneath the front door mat or underneath the maze is the key. Underneath the maze is the key, and it looks like this. And the surprising news is that as we begin to recognize the infinite worth in others, oddly enough, we begin to see it in ourselves. Decades into this journey, I've come to the conclusion that to the degree that I'm open to seeing infinite worth in others, I've begun to see it in myself. And this was not an easy slide to put up. But in reality, I have my moments. So that deeper than how we look, deeper than what we do and how well or how poorly we do it, deeper even than who we think we are and that painful voice we carry in our head, you are lovable, and so am I. The gate of heaven is everywhere, including in that mirror that you'll look in later today. The single awareness that has changed everything in my life is due to Frank Kemper, October 3rd, 1970. He taught me a way to see that I have not been able to unsee. Each of us have infinite worth, even when we don't believe it. We each matter, and we matter absolutely. So I want to thank each of you for being here, and I want to close with some photography again from Lee Jeffries, from Michelle Marshall from the MC1R project, and Rebecca Templin, who filmed and took pictures of some of the moms and babies that I've had the privilege of working with through the years. There'll be some music written and played by Jared Tanner. Thank you very much.